Hi, it's Mr. Truitt here, and I put together this slideshow to help you get started with your first formal essay on Oedipus next week. I know that introductions and conclusions are not new concepts for you. I'm sure that your ELA teachers have covered this before, but I'm going to challenge you to look at your conclusions and your introductions and conclusions a little bit differently. I'm going to be looking for these areas to be more sophisticated than has been expected of you until now. So just briefly, introductions and conclusions do just that. They're there to introduce the topic and thesis, and then at the beginning, and then wrap up the essay after you've done your analysis. You've been taught a very literal way of doing each of these, but I'm going to show you ways of expanding each of those types of paragraphs so that they're more insightful, more thoughtful, and reveal more interesting information to the reader. So the examples I've chosen to illustrate different aspects of the introductions and conclusions are drawn from our readings so far this year. But the concepts that we're talking about will be applicable to any literature you write about, whether it's short stories / fiction, plays, or poetry. And it also will extend beyond just literature. So the concepts that we're looking at today will come in handy for if you're writing papers on psychology or history or whatever other topic or whatever other discipline you're writing about. So this is the beginning of a process that you will be able to apply across the board, and this isn't just something that applies to literature. Okay, so let's look at how to structure and develop an intro paragraph for a literary analysis essay. So one way that it's useful to think about an essay in general is to look at it as a hamburger analogy. So obviously the hamburger has a bun on top and bottom, top and bottom, and then there's the meat and the fixings in between. So we've looked at the meat elements, the meat and the fixings, such as things like locating the theme, making claims, providing evidence from the text of the stories to support your claims. That's really the heart, the meat of what goes into the body of your essay. So the introduction and the conclusion are what form the top bun and the bottom bun. They hold the meat and the fixings together to continue the metaphor. It holds them together, but it also allows the reader to digest what you've written easier. So let's see. Okay, so organizing the introduction paragraph. So when you start a formal essay, you want to start from a broad perspective or a wider focus. You don't want to just jump in and start talking about the text, the story, whatever work you're looking at. You want to kind of ease the reader into your essay and into your topic, and not jump directly to the substance of what you're trying to say. So one way to do that is to visualize the level of focus that goes into each element of the paragraph as an upside down triangle, as you can see here in the slide. So you start off with something called a hook, which is it's used to draw the reader's attention in, or reader in, and grab their attention. with something interesting and thought-provoking. If you picture, the metaphor of the hook being like a fisherman, you're a fisherman trying to lure in and grab and pull in your reader. That's what the hook is supposed to do. So you offer an interesting or thought-provoking tidbit at the beginning to pull them in. You're not going to spend a lot of time developing this thought, so it doesn't need to be real developed. It doesn't need to be something that's fully, it's not going to be several sentences of development. It's just something to hold out there to lure the reader in. It's considered broader in the sense that it can address philosophical questions or just general scenarios that you offer the reader that aren't necessarily directly related to the text that you're going to analyze. So the idea behind it has to be relevant. You're going to connect it eventually to what you have to say in the body or even in the thesis, but it can stand on its own without needing to be connected to the text. So, for example, if your thesis is on Oedipus, about Oedipus having something to do with how hard it is to know somebody, even to know yourself, your hook might open with a question like, have you ever wondered what it means to truly know someone? A person might have been close friends with someone their whole lives, and suddenly their friend wasn't who they seemed. So you open up with a question about, how do you really know who somebody is? How do you count for being close friends with somebody for forever, and suddenly you realize you didn't really know them at all? That isn't directly tied to Oedipus, but it's tied to a concept that you're going to develop further in the paper. So it gets the reader thinking, along the lines of where you want them to go. So after you've gotten their attention, then you want to tie the point that you made in the hook with a short summary of the text. Now, the summary becomes a little bit more specific, as it narrows down, because you're going to be tying it directly to something from the text. It contains specific information about the story to help orient the reader about what you want them to focus on in the work. So therefore, the summary shouldn't be comprehensive in the sense that you shouldn't be trying to go through every plot twist or every character and how they relate to the bigger picture. It should focus on the aspects of the story that are related to or directly related to your thesis. So for instance, you don't have to tell me every character, every plot twist, every detail that furthers the plot. So finally, after you have finished the summary, you're going to finish up the intro paragraph with the thesis statement that's specifically tied to the work. So you're going to be making a claim about the theme, characters, or other ideas in the work and how the author develops them. So we'll look at how each of those elements, the hook, the summary of the text, and the thesis, can be developed and practically put into motion. We're going to look at each element and then build a sample introductory paragraph. Okay, hold on one second. I got to. Okay, so starting with the hook. So as I explained in the overview slide, the first thing that you need to do is grab the reader's attention. And really, this is a fun part of the process. I know a lot of the, the writing process is grueling. It requires a lot of um, just mulling over analytical stuff that you're trying to understand what the writer's saying and putting it in your words, and it's very difficult to articulate sometimes, and you don't get a lot of opportunity to express yourself or your creativity as you do the analysis. Um, but the hook gives you that ability to brainstorm and come up with creative ways that show your personality or your perspective related to the more intellectual or academic topic. So the point of the hook is to immediately engage the reader and to make them want to keep reading. So, in other words, if you seem bored with your topic from the start, they probably are going to be as well, and they might not keep reading your essay. Now, I'm an exception because I have to read your work. So, whether or not I think you're bored or excited about the essay is irrelevant. I'm going to read it, regardless of what your take is. So. So just like the summary should be related to the details of your work, the details of the work that your thesis is focused on, your hook should relate directly to the ideas that your thesis will develop. So for instance, in the quotation, one of the ways that you can develop a hook is by using a quotation from the text, directly drawn from the text. So in this quote about To Kill a Mockingbird, if your thesis makes the point that Harper Lee argues against prejudging people or are in favor of giving people the benefit of the doubt, you might use a quote like this. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. So that would give you an opportunity to put in the reader's mind that you're going to talk about what it's like to see things from another person's perspective by using the quote from the text. Another way that quotes are often, hooks are often handled are by making a strong, insightful, or startling statement that you're going to develop. So, for instance, if your thesis is about what Scout learns about maturing or maturity and the hard realities of life, you might make a statement like this: the journey from childhood into adulthood can be as painful as it is inevitable. So you're offering up this tantalizing statement to the reader about this transition, the movement from childhood to adulthood, and how it's painful and inevitable, that you can't avoid it. And that would tie into your thesis about what Scout learns about maturing and how hard that is. So that's the basics about the hook. Okay, so I have put together a few examples of how to develop a hook, different ideas for approaches or strategies and techniques using examples from the class readings so far. So let's start with interesting observation. So we're starting off an essay on Dead Man's Path, and I might start the opening hook with something that says, a teacher's job is usually only requires them to think about making lesson plans, teaching students, grading assignments, and other classroom activities. Michael Obie's job requires much more of him. The schoolmaster in Chinua Achebe's story, Dead Man's Path, has to consider the dead spirits of the village's ancestors and the souls of new children arriving as a basic part of his job. So I start off with an observation about a generic observation about what teachers generally are expected to do, what's expected of them, and then tie that into something unusual that the main character in Dead Man's Path, has to deal with in addition to the normal expectations. So that's one way. A second approach is to ask a rhetorical question. So if someone asks a question to which there's no real answer, such as, what is the meaning of life? How do you answer it? What kinds of things do you consider? In the dilemma tale, The Five Helpers, readers are asked to ponder exactly this kind of unanswerable question. So this hook is kind of a setup. It sets up where you want to go with talking about the questions that are asked in the story The Five Helpers. So it gets the reader thinking. If someone were to ask you a similar type of question that can't be answered, how do you think about that? How do you go about answering it? And then that will lead into a more specific discussion of Dead Man's Path. Of The Five Helpers. Okay, so a third type of hook that you can develop is, we've already looked at one example from To Kill a Mockingbird, but we can use a quote. When the artist in Franz Kafka's short story, The Hunger Artist, confesses that he has no choice but to be hungry, he gives a perplexing explanation. Because I couldn't find any food that I liked, had I found some, believe me, I wouldn't have made any fuss. I would have stuffed myself just like you and everyone else. So this use of a quote, you have to provide a little bit of context. So it starts off, saying that the hunger artist confesses that he has no choice but to be hungry, and then that leads into the quote, so that it makes more sense when he starts talking about how he couldn't find any food that he liked. And then finally, an attention-grabbing scenario. So this example of a hook technique would start off, even when life seems good and the future is bright, the most successful person can find their world turned upside down. Without explanation and out of the clear blue, an honest man could be falsely accused of a crime for which he spends the rest of his life, or their life, being punished. Such was the fate of Ivan Dmitrievich Aksionov, the protagonist of Leo Tolstoy's story, The Long Exile. So it starts off with this scenario about how even, when things look rosy, the sky is blue, the sun's out, everything's going well, even on those kinds of days, the world can turn upside down and forever be changed. And that is what happened to the protagonist of the story that you want to write about. And then you'll go on to do the summary, and then probably a thesis, about the importance of how you look at life. So those are just four examples of how you could go about developing your hook. So you want to make sure as you move from the hook to the summary, one thing that you want to think about is to connect the hook, directly. You don't want to just open up with a hook that's interesting, it's attention grabbing, but it doesn't necessarily, connect with what comes after. So, for instance, going back to our example about Dead Man's Path, you start off with a teacher's job usually only requires them to think about assignments, so on and so forth. And then immediately go to, in Dead Man's Path, Michael Obi wants to get rid of old-fashioned superstitions because he thinks they're useless. That second sentence there doesn't make it clear what relevance your opening sentence has. It doesn't make clear why you're talking about what a teacher's job usually requires of them. There's something missing in there. There's a connection that's being dropped. So if you go back to the original hook from my example, and then connect it to this this new information about him wanting to get rid of or not new, but the final sentence there about getting rid of the old-fashioned superstitions. We'll start here with this last sentence. He has to consider the dead spirits of the village's ancestors and the souls of new children arriving as a basic part of his job. This part of the job is challenging because the new schoolmaster Obi wants to get rid of old-fashioned superstitions. So you make it clear, why you're suddenly talking about Michael Obi wanting to get rid of the superstitions. So you make the point that the part of him, being expected to take into consideration the beliefs and traditions of the village, you're talking about that because he has no interest in it. He has no interest in continuing and humoring these beliefs that he sees as outdated, superannuated, as they use in the term they use in the story. So sometimes you need to have that connecting phrase or even a full sentence to make clear, the connection between the hook and the summary. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out, an element that needs to be included in your introduction is always identifying the title and author of the work. And sometimes you'll have different levels of identifying the work that you need to include. So if you're talking specifically about a chapter, if your analysis is going to focus on a specific chapter within a longer work, you might have to say the name of the overall work as well as the title of the chapter. But for the most part, for this class at least, it's going to be pretty straightforward. It'll most likely just be the name of the work of fiction, the play, or the poem. In any case, early in your introduction, you need to state the work and the author. So make sure that you properly punctuate and spell both the author and the work. So just a note about how to properly punctuate different types of literary works. So books, plays, newspapers, movies, anything that is a longer, complete work within itself gets italicized. Short stories, poems, articles, chapters within a longer work, they get quotation marks around them. So, for instance, the Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex by Sophocles has fascinated readers for centuries. So you can see Oedipus Rex, that's a long self-contained play. So it gets italicized. And then in Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, the legacy of colonialism is explored. Again, a novel is a long work. It's considered complete in itself. So it would be, the title would be italicized. On the other hand, the short story Dead Man's Path by Chinua Achebe tells the story of Michael Obi, a young African man who seeks to impose European values. Dead Man's Path is a short piece of fiction that can't stand as a work by itself, so it gets quotes around it. And then finally, a slightly different example, because we haven't read any poetry yet this semester, so I just picked an example of a work that I'm kind of fond of. So after reading Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, many readers examine their own lives to reconsider the decisions they've made. The Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken, is a short poem. It's maybe 20 lines, if even that. So it can't stand on its own as a book length work on its own, so it gets quotes around it. And if you go back to the example that we used on the previous slide about the Dead Man's Path, and the scenario about the teacher's responsibilities, that works in Dead Man's Path as well, to be in quotation marks. So just as another example to look at. The next piece of the introduction that you're going to work on is a summary of the work that you're analyzing. It's important for you to review the basic plot and conflicts and characters and those high-level pieces of information about the work, so that the reader is oriented to what you're talking about and knows what part of the work you're going to focus on. The summary needs to come early, before the body paragraphs, since the body paragraphs should be focused on digging deeper into the meanings of the literary elements rather than rehashing the superficial storylines. So therefore the summary needs to go in the introduction before you jump into the body paragraphs. We're going to look at how to use something called the five-finger summary in order to do this, incorporated into the introduction. The five-finger summary is a technique that offers an easy way to give an overview of the work quickly and with just the right amount of detail. So I'd like you to pause here, watch the short video on the five-finger summary and how it works, and then come back and I'll talk to you about how to use the summary method to build your introduction paragraph. I'll see you shortly. Okay, real quickly, the 5 elements of the five-finger summary, and it comes in real handy to use your hand, to count them off. So I'll just hold my hand up just as a reminder of which element we're talking about. So the first one is somebody. This is the character that you're focusing on, or characters if there's more than one. We will mostly be looking at just one main character in each scenario. Wanted is the second element. Wanted is the important action related to your theme. So a little bit about the plot that is related to that character. The third one is but. That's the main conflict, the problem that the character is trying to sort out or is facing, and needs to resolve. Then that's the tension in the conflict. How does the character try to deal with it? And then how does everything end? What's the resolution? You don't need to go into a lot of detail about, like I said, about the plot twists and how, everything resolves, all the complexities of how things resolve. You just need to come up with a summary statement that covers each of these elements so that the reader is at least familiar with the basic context or basic scenario that you're going to be addressing. Okay, so we will take as an example Oedipus. This should help you with putting together your planner for this week and transferring it to your essay on Oedipus next week. So the five-finger summary in Oedipus. So somebody, the character you're going to be focusing on, would be Oedipus. It would be possible to write about some of the other characters. You could write on Jocasta or on Creon, but for an essay, or for this particular essay, you're going to be mostly focused on Oedipus. How because he's the central character, he is where the central action that all the other characters are revolving around. So Oedipus wanted, he wanted to find the murderer to relieve Thebes of the plague. Some of the details that, especially with a work like Oedipus, where it would be real tempting to try to weave in and out and explain how he went from being the baby to being the killer to taking over as king of Thebes. You don't need to include all of that weaving and winding detail, or you don't have to talk about how he solved the riddle of the Sphinx and how he confronted the Sphinx and came up with the answer. And it's not that this kind of information isn't important, or that it won't be important at some point in your essay. It's just that you want to give enough information so that the reader can follow along with what you're focusing on in the story. So in this case, you'll just want to include the details like the plague or Oedipus's search for justice. Okay, the but here. But it's revealed that Oedipus himself is the murderer. Then, the tension and the conflict, then Oedipus blinds himself after discovering he is the cause of the plague. So not only is the main conflict that he himself is the murderer, but as a reaction or as a response, Oedipus blinds himself upon realizing that he is the murderer, is causing the plague. And then finally, the so. Oedipus is no longer king of Thebes and is preparing to be exiled into the desert. So that would give a good synopsis of some of the basic details that the reader would need to know to understand your analysis of his search for justice. Okay, so the five-finger summary isn't meant to be just an exercise in itself. It's just preparation to help you develop, the actual writing in the introductory paragraph. So we've provided kind of a template, a fill-in-the-blank template here that once you've filled it in, you can insert it into your intro paragraph as, the next step after your hook. So filling in the template here, in Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, we get the intro and, the title and the author in the intro there. Oedipus, who's the somebody, wanted to find who murdered King Laius to cure the plague that was ravaging Thebes. We have the wanted element, but he discovered that he was the murderer. So Oedipus punishes himself by blinding himself and orders himself banished from Thebes. Then, no longer the king, Oedipus prepares to wander in the desert. So you'll notice that my wording here is a little bit different than what was in the five-finger summary. The five-finger summary should be a guide for the kind of ideas that you're going to express in the intro, but you don't have to just copy it and paste it verbatim. And also, as we're going to look at in, I believe it's the next slide, sometimes you're going to need extra sentences to make the connection between the different elements. So it might not just be one phrase or one sentence for wanted, but, so, and then. Okay. So sometimes there's going to be more than one major conflict that you can identify in a work, and more than one conflict that involves or affects how the story plays out. So in Oedipus, what might an alternative five-finger summary look like if we changed the wanted element, it's from what we have to Oedipus wanted to escape a prophecy that predicted he would kill his father and marry his mother. So we would have the same opening in Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. Oedipus wanted to escape a prophecy that predicted he would kill his father and marry his mother, but then you would need to alter the elements after that. So, but his attempt to run away from the prophecy causes him to fulfill it. So Oedipus realizes that he is the murderer that has caused the plague in Thebes. Then he blinds himself out of grief and is exiled from Thebes as punishment for his crime. So you'll see there's still some carryover. For instance, you still talk about him being the cause of the plague and him being exiled from Thebes. But for instance, here the then element talks about the grief that he feels, that might be part of what you bring up in your thesis, his personal reaction that he's devastated by what he's inadvertently done. That's an element that's different than the other scenario that we looked at that simply was talking about how he prepares to be in the desert, blinded and wandering. So, moving on. So we go from the hook to the summary, and now we're at the thesis statement. Again, I understand that thesis statement isn't something new for you, that the concept's been brought up. You've been introduced to it, in other ELA classes, but we're going to be fine-tuning and further developing how you think about the thesis and what it does for your writing. So the thesis is the most specific part of the intro, and it makes a debatable claim, specifically about the work that you are attempting. It's making a claim that you're attempting to prove about the work that you're writing on. So what is meant by a debatable claim? Basically, it's a statement that can be proven using argument and persuasion based on support by the quotes, details in the story, or secondary research about the work. We're not going to be looking at secondary research, that is published by other scholars and other authors until next semester. So that's not something that you're really going to need to worry about right now, but at some point that's going to come into play. For right now, I'm looking for you to be able to back up your claims with information that's taken directly from the text. So examples of what's not debatable, things like thesis statements that give your opinion or make judgment statements. If you look at the examples that we have down here of what a thesis statement looks like. So for the assignment that we're working on right now, a thesis statement would look like your theme statement, and then the literary elements you're going to use to prove the theme, at least for this essay. Not every paper that you're going to write will have a thesis or a theme that directly analyzes the devices, the literary devices that the author uses. but I'm just using, because we're preparing for this first essay on Oedipus, I'm using that as an example. So um, the example of a good thesis about the piece of string. In the piece of string, Guy de Maupassant, his use of characterization and irony shows that even though the townspeople treated him unfairly, Hochkorn is ultimately to blame for his misery because he allowed something trivial to take over his life. That would be a well-written, debatable claim. Um, somebody could take exception to, some of that, the points that are made there. You could say, no, he's not to blame for what ultimately happens. It's the townspeople. They bear responsibility for treating him so badly and for him losing his mind. Um, and then your task in the paper, if this is your thesis, is to um, use support from the story to back up your opinion that he's to blame. Now I say your opinion there. Um, it when I say it's your opinion that he is ultimately to blame for the misery, that's that's coming from a place that's based in the text. When I say that a good thesis statement, isn't opinion based, we can look at the not example below that. Guy de Maupassant's story, The Piece of String, is a timeless tale that does an excellent job of showing why you shouldn't worry about other people's opinions. This has two pieces of opinion that aren't debatable. A timeless tale. What exactly does that mean? I can't really argue with you because I don't know what that means. You're giving your opinion or your judgment about the nature of the work that can't really be debated, no matter how much no matter how many examples or how much you quote from the story. um, you're not going to be able to carry on a debate about whether it's timeless or not. The same thing about does an excellent job. That judgment about how well he carries out the thesis isn't debatable. You could say why you think it's excellent, but there's no real way that I could come back and say, no, that isn't great. So the less of your own personal judgment, or the less that you play critic in talking about what is well done or what is poorly done, the less you do of that, the better your thesis statement's going to be. Okay, so let's pretend we're writing an essay on the piece of string and apply the concepts from the past few slides. So I filled in each of the elements, starting with the hook. So the hook would be an intriguing statement about how something trivial can ruin someone's life. The five-finger summary would start off with Maître Hochkorn is somebody. He wanted to save a piece of string he found in case it might be useful later. But he was accused of stealing Maître Holbrook's wallet by Maître Malandin. Then Maître Hochkorn became obsessed with proving his innocence. So Hochkorn dies miserable and broken because no one would believe him. And then the thesis would be the theme plus the literary elements you will use to demonstrate the theme. And just note, as with moving between the hook and the summary, you might need a sentence or a connecting phrase to make the move from the summary to the thesis more grammatically correct, or make the ideas flow smoothly. Okay, so taking you know, the outline that we just looked at and giving it more flesh, you know, making it into actual paragraph form, sentence and paragraph form. So the hook that we described about you know, how something trivial can turn into something life-changing and destructive. I developed the hook to say, people often hold on to things that seem unimportant in case they might need to be needed someday. In the case of Maître Hochekorn in Guy de Maupassant's story, A Piece of String, his obsession with trivial things ruins his life. So you toss that out there, that not only is it, you know, a waste of time potentially, but it could ruin your life. It ruined this character's life. That makes the reader go, how did it ruin his life? Why, you know, tell me more. And then the summary. Hochkorn wants to save something trivial, a piece of string he picked out of the mud, in case it might be useful in the future, but his enemy, Maître Malandin, swears he was picking up and stealing Maître Holbrook's wallet, not a piece of string. Then, even though the charges of stealing the wallet are eventually dropped, Hochkorn spends the rest of his life trying to prove his innocence to the townspeople. His obsession with other people's opinions of him overwhelms him, so Maître Hochkorn dies miserable and broken because no one believes him. So you get, you know, a bare outline or skeleton of the major events in the story, the characters that are involved that you might potentially talk about in the body. And then moving into the thesis, characterization and irony are used to show that even though the townspeople treated him unfairly, Hochkorn is ultimately to blame for this misery. Notice the previous sentence talking about him dying miserable and broken. That is worked into the thesis so that you have a connection back to the summary. So Hochkorn is ultimately to blame for his misery and his brokenness because he allowed something trivial to take over his life. So we're moving from that broad statement about how trivial things in general, you know, can you know, can hurt people, you know, if they cling to them too closely, to coming to the specific point that Hochkorn is one of those people whose life is ruined because he couldn't tell the difference between what's trivial and what's important. Okay, so that is a quick overview of how to craft your introduction. Now we're going to move on to the conclusion paragraph. So, you know, as you wrap up your analysis, you can't just stop cold. You can't just go, that's all, folks. I mean, you can, but it leaves the reader hanging. You know, it just makes it feel incomplete. So the purpose of the conclusion is to help create that feeling of completeness of your analysis. It is a paragraph that allows you to reflect on your argument and review what you've written and claimed, and help the reader see some important things that you've uncovered, some important information or patterns that you have developed in the body. You've probably been taught that a conclusion is where you say, in conclusion, this is what I've said, and this was my thesis. We are going to go beyond that. In fact, you shouldn't be saying in conclusion anymore. Once you get to this point in the essay, it's going to be clear that you're entering your conclusion. You're going from active analysis to being reflective. You're reviewing what you've already said. So you don't need to say in conclusion. So the conclusion is going to be more than just a verbatim repetition of your major points. like you probably have been taught. The conclusion is where you explore the conclusions, the therefore, this is what I think type of revelations that you've come up with, that your reading and writing has revealed. So it's where you revisit your original claim and you stress how you've proved it and what you've learned or what you want the reader to learn. So all of that, gets packed into the conclusion, not just this is what I said, this is, what my thesis was. So the conclusion can be visualized as a regular triangle. So we talked about how, the intro is an inverted triangle. This one is just a regular triangle with the narrow part at the top and becoming broader in focus as you move further down. So like I said, it's the opposite in its focus of how the introduction starts on a broad focus and then becomes narrower. So the topic sentence of your conclusion is going to be a restatement of your thesis. And it's okay, at least at this point, to use similar wording to what your original thesis was, what you used in the intro. But eventually, you should work towards wording your thesis in a fresh way, that shows a different perspective or a different way of understanding what the thesis was. From there, you move to a summary of the main points of your argument or the most interesting aspects of your thesis. What interesting things did you explore that you want the reader to remember? And then you wrap it up with a lasting thought that it pulls together the gist of what you've been trying to say in the paper. And a good lasting thought will take what you've already said and project it into other scenarios or into the future, and we'll look at a couple examples of that in a minute. But it shouldn't just be, this was my paper and this is how I'm ending it, not that literal and not that straightforward. Okay, so the opening sentence of your conclusion is very similar to an opening statement like the lawyer would give to the judge or jury in a court case. So it gives you a chance to reframe your argument and make sure the reader is understanding your position exactly as you want it to be considered. So restating the thesis. So let's look here, look at the thesis to begin with, just a reminder of what you said in the first place, what you said in the intro. So the original thesis was, characterization and irony are used to show that even though the townspeople treated him unfairly, Hochkorn is ultimately to blame for his misery because he allowed something trivial to take over his life. So then when it comes time to restate the thesis, I didn't include the literary elements there. But you could work them back in, but I chose to reframe this idea of the misery of his life, and said, when Hochkorn can't let go of the need to clear his name, he shows that sometimes the way difficulties are dealt with affects a person's life more than the actual difficulties. So I chose to look at what actually caused the misery in his life that the original thesis refers to. It's not the actual difficulties. It's not the being accused of this petty crime that ruins him and causes him to be miserable. It's the way he reacts to it that leads to that brokenness. So it gives a fresh perspective on the original idea that you have introduced in the thesis. So for the summary of the main points of the essay, and of course I'm filling these in. I haven't actually written this essay, but this is how I would summarize the main points that I would have written if I had, you know, if this was from a real essay. So a hypothetical summary in the conclusion would be something like this. Taking a close look at his character, remember characterization was one of the elements that was going to be used to develop the theme. So taking a close look at his character shows how his insecurities take over his life, and he can't see beyond the incident with Maitre Holbrook's wallet. It is not enough for him that he was not found guilty by the courts and faced no legal repercussions. His ego insists that everyone agree that he did not steal the wallet, so on and so forth, and instead his desperate need to change their opinion just egged on the doubters. So this gives 4 or 5 of the main points that I would have used or that I would have developed around characterization and irony in the story. You know, the irony that you know he's eventually let go. He's eventually exonerated from the charges. Yet he continues to act as if he's still being charged, as if he's still being prosecuted. And then finally, the lasting thought. So this is another opportunity, just like the hook, the opening hook. It's an opportunity to show your creativity and your ability to understand the deeper implications of what you've written, or project the principles of your thesis beyond just the story or the text that you're working on. So one of the ways to look at the lasting thought is, to show why the points you've made or the theme you've discussed matters. So you're going to show the bigger implications of what you've written. So for the piece of string, you could possibly reflect on how Hoshkorn's life could have turned out differently. Given all these things that he, allowed himself to be miserable, what would have happened if he had just been like the mother in Tuesday Siesta and, turned his back on the mockery and the ridicule? What would his life potentially have looked like? Another way you could end it would be how Hoshkorn could have reacted that would have changed things. It's kind of a same way of addressing the first option here, the first bullet point. But it could have talked about specific actions that he could have done. He could have left the town. He didn't have to stay there. Why did he stay there when he knew that every time he turned around, he'd be reminded of this injustice against him? So you could talk about, what reactions could he have done differently? And one possible lasting thought, an actual articulation of that principle would be something like, Hoshkorn's inability to accept that the world is flawed and full of injustice, or full of mean people and injustice, cost him his life. So basically, you wrap it up and say, because he can't let go of these things that pester his ego, he basically kills himself. It's not suicide, but he's responsible. He brings his own death upon him because of this character flaw in him. So it wraps up the essay, wraps up your thesis by making a pronouncement on the character himself and his characterization. So I've taken the different paragraphs that we developed in the intro and the conclusion and put them together in MLA format, just so you can see what the finished product of this kind of exercise looks like in an MLA format. So You can see it's followed the basic elements, the spacing, the header, the heading on the first page, and then you can see the works cited. Your essay coming up for Oedipus will need to have the works cited on a separate page as well. So hopefully you can use this walkthrough and the examples as you write your first formal essay next week. I'll go over the instructions about the essay in class on Tuesday, go over what's expected and how you can use the planner that you've been working on to further develop an actual sentence and paragraph based essay instead of just the planner. So have a great day, and I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in class.